Well, welcome back, folks, to a little Yamaha engine reassembly. If you recall from our last video, we installed the shifter shaft and engaged it with the shift drum here, as well as the indexing mechanism up here in the upper left, and installed the kickstart mechanism. Now we're going to move on to installing the primary drive gear, which will go on the end of the crankshaft here. This is the primary drive gear, along with the lock washer and nut. This is a directional gear, that is, it is not identical on both sides, and you can see I labeled it out, which means that faces out, obviously, and this is the inside. Where this fits over the splines, right there, is inset a bit versus being flush on this side, so it clearly is directional. And I'll just reiterate, when you take parts or items apart like this, assemblies, take your time, label and group your parts together so there's no question about what goes where, as you can see here. So now I'm going to cut this zip tie off, mount the gear, snug up the nut. I'm not going to torque it at this point. I think I'll do that after I have the clutch basket on. Besides, I have to look up the torque setting, and I don't recall what that is right off the top. So we'll just go ahead and get this mounted. I'm just going to put a little light machine oil around the splines here, just to give them a little lubrication for the engagement of the gear. Again, I'm going to orient the gear with the inside in or down in this case. See if we can find the best way for this to fit over the splines. Like that. Those are usually quite a snug fit, by the way. There, that's good and snug. Again, I'll torque it to its final setting when I've got the clutch basket on, and I can engage the two and lock them. So I'll come back and torque that a little bit later. You notice I got a screwdriver through the connecting rods here, so connecting, or the crankshaft won't turn. That's all that's for. So we got that done. We're going to continue on now with the assembly of the clutch basket and the associated parts that go with it. At this point now we have to really pay attention to order of items. Not that there's so many of them, but that there's some thrust washers and bearings and such that we need to be particular in how it goes together, because it'd be real easy to get things turned around. Recall how I talked about taking detailed photos and taking your time on disassembly and keeping the order of things organized in such a way that it becomes obvious later on when you go to reassemble the engine how the parts go. And this is an example or situation where that will pay dividends. An example would be, and this is a simple one, I'll show you a more involved one in a moment, but this is an engagement gear that goes over the shaft, and these lugs right here engage with the back of the clutch basket, something like that. And this washer goes on first, goes up against the bearing here, and then this gear fits down over it. And then the spacer right here in my left hand, this is what's called a spacer, goes down inside of it. In these thrust washers, there's a bearing right here, and then an outside washer go on the outside of the basket. And we'll get into that in more detail later, but knowing which washer goes where, this is a thinner washer here, right here. That's quite a bit thinner than that washer. Knowing the order and which side of the basket they go on is real important. And I'll show you a moment here on the video screen how I kept track of all of this as I took it apart. There's an example of that first gear that we just talked about. I'm hand holding the camera here, so you'll have to bear with me. So that is that gear. You can see the washer. So it goes like that. That's the actual photo when I was taking the pieces apart from the engine back in late June. Here's an example of the spacer, which is right here. It goes in over that shaft and inside of the clutch basket. Here's the outer washer. There's the thrust bearing, and on the inside of that is that thin washer I just showed you. Right there. And this assembly, as you see it in my hand right now, is how I literally took it apart and zip tied it together immediately so I knew the order. So now I use this photo only as reference to know which side of the clutch basket it goes on. Now it might seem that it would be obvious, but it's not. If you're not sure, then that's where these kind of things, these photos really come in handy. There's a better view of the clutch basket. This is the inner plate of the clutch basket. The spacer with oil grooves in it. That's that. You can see that right there. And then this is actually the thin washer on the inside of where my thumb is. Alright, enough of that. We'll go ahead now and get started on assembly of the clutch basket. The first thing I need to do is cut that zip tie. Again, this is that large wash that goes on first, like that, up against the bearing boss. And then this gear fits on like that. You'll notice it has to engage with the Kickstarter gear. Next thing we'll put in place, I've got to cut this apart. Next thing we'll put in place is this spacer. Now, based on the photos, I know that this slot right here, this groove with a hole in the middle, goes out. I could tell from the photos that I took, and I referenced the Yamaha microfiche and then alluded to that as well. This goes on like that. Keep the gear engaged, make sure this is centered, which it is like that. Next thing that's going to go on is the clutch basket itself. Again, these notches here, these two notches, will align with those raised sections we'll engage with to allow everything to lock together. So when I put this together, I have to engage these notches with their mating pieces here, as well as getting this gear aligned over here with the primary drive. So I have to get those two things to come together at the same time, which might require a little finessing. So what I'm going to do now is I have to look underneath to see where those Notice I had to pick it up and turn it a little bit to make sure that underneath I can see. I'm looking in from the side. You can't see that obviously. That those pieces came together like that, and I've got full engagement over here on the primary drive side, right there. So you can see now it's locked together. Based on the photos I know, and I did reference the Yamaha microfiche, though that wasn't terribly helpful. Outside of showing the relative parts order, it didn't show any detail. I know this thin thrust, they actually call a thrust washer, goes down first. Then this bearing, that's a bearing, goes on next. And then this large washer goes on like that. Next thing to go on then is the inner part of the clutch basket. Again, it's just keyed. You can see the notches. This is not directional on this engine. Some engines you have to orient the inner basket or the inner cone with the outer basket. In this engine you don't have to. It's not designed that way. Then the next thing we'll need to do is put the lock washer and nut on. Now, I'm going to confess here something. This is the lock washer that came off this engine originally. And normally I would replace this with new. And I made a mistake. When I ordered, went through months ago now and ordered parts for this engine, I failed to somehow or other order a replacement for this, which you still can get new from Yamaha. If this was a daily use motor or a high performance engine, I would pause now and order a new lock washer. But since this is really going to be a show bike and isn't really going to be run that often, I'm going to straighten this washer out. You can see it's a little bent up. I'm going to straighten it and flatten it, clean it up, and I'm going to reuse it, which generally I prefer not to do. Okay, through the magic of television, I'm back instantly with a straightened locking tab. You can see I've got it reasonably straight. Took a file, cleaned this roughness up here a bit on both sides. Take note of this locking tab here. That locking tab fits into that notch right there in the clutch hub to prevent the lock washer from turning. A locking tab, so it goes something like that. Next thing we'll do is I'll apply a little bit of anti-seize to the threads here, and then figure out how I'm going to torque down this this nut as well as the primary drive nut. This shaft spins, as you can see here, and I have to come up with a way of locking this so that when I tighten this nut, that shaft doesn't turn like that. There's a couple of ways you can go about it. You can actually buy commercially made tools for this, which I don't have. And in the next video, I'll talk about how I'm going to secure this, what kind of tool I'm going to use, and we'll show the process of tightening these two nuts down and moving on with the clutch assembly. That's it for this video, folks. Any questions or comments, feel free to drop me a note. And as usual, thanks for watching.